Hey, everybody. Hey, welcome to Tuesday, week 4, Shasta College Humanities 2, our exploration of the humanities from the Renaissance to modern times. Hope you're all enjoying your summer vacay of lockdown. It's not quite as hot today as it has been, but I want to talk about today a period that covers the 1700s to about 1830s or so. And in your textbook, if you're following along, hope you are, if you have the text, is chapter 26. I'm skipping a bunch of chapters. We can't do the whole book. We don't have time. We're just we're going into the heavy, important eras. I mean, it's all important, but this is a heavy 100 years here that needs to be covered. So when you're reading it, keep in mind the importance of what's happening in the history of the world right then and there. Lots of stuff is happening. It is we're coming into what they would consider modern times. You think this is modern? Folks, we're in a postmodern. I'll explain that later, but we're in a postmodern now. But this is lots of things are happening in this era of world history. And things are starting to happen in America also. During this time in America, we're developing as a country, and later on in the 1700s, we go to war with Britain, our American Revolution. That's important. Why that's happening in Europe later on in the 1800s, Napoleon's going to war with lots of European. But that's another discussion. We'll be talking about Napoleon today, who was really an important figure in the history of the world. And you might have an impression of Napoleon as being a guy who went in and grabbed a bunch of countries, but actually in which he did, but in France, he's a hero. He's not the villain. Did he go too far? Absolutely. Did he have his country's best interests at heart? Absolutely. But he did overreach his power base, that's for sure. But we're not going to hit Napoleon today. But what's happening now is music is changing. They're inventing what we would consider the modern keyboard. They didn't have. That's a long process of developing the piano. It wasn't even called the piano in those days, but that's in that chapter. You'll read it. And there was architecture and design was becoming very ornate and flowery, very, very ornate. It was called Rococo design, and the music was rather flowery and ornate, and so was people's clothing and the buildings and their furnishings. Of course, people could afford it. And that was spilling over into America also. If you've ever been back east, anywhere, hopefully you have, especially Boston, you'll see the designs, what I'm talking about. They're famous buildings, the Washington Monument, not that, but other monuments in Washington have this architecture style. And it looks like when these buildings were being designed, it looked like it's a good place, time in the history of mankind. Things were kind of looking up. And so we're emulating our success. More people than ever before can read and write. And so novels are being born. I'll talk about writing next week, not this week. I know I've covered playwriting, but I want to talk literature in depth later. Believe it or not, the first flush toilet came about. That's a biggie, folks. Have you ever lived without a flush toilet? Have you? Could you? Anyway, that happened in the late 1700s. We got steam heat. For the first time, there was steam heat coming into buildings and households. No longer were we having to stoke the fires with wood. You know, in our history 200-300 years ago, wood smoke covered most cities because everybody was burning wood smoke or coal, whatever they could get their hands on. And it was very smoky times, a lot of pollution out there. The other thing that came out, believe it or not, in Paris in the late 1700s was the bicycle. People are getting around now. No more horse and carriage. There was still that. That's still the main transport, but back you get around on a bicycle. And that became a new invention that brought us into the modern times, modern world. So all this was going on. And in this, they called the architecture Neoclassical Architecture, which is essentially the new classical. So we went from kind of a religious architecture, cathedrals, big churches, to this new architecture, and America embraced it. And America is no longer the weak stepchild of Europe. It's developing its own way of doing things, way of doing. We're still not producing musicians or artists quite yet on the caliber of Europe, but we're getting there. But our neoclassical architecture could be seen in Washington, D.C., go back to the East Coast. You have to go to East Coast, folks, because there's very few people living out here in the West, and Boston. And you'll see this old architecture still exists. The buildings have been maintained. And so now America's finally playing a part in the world of culture, the world of politics. Things are starting to heat up. And but right now, I want you guys to look at the music of this era. And how many of you listen to classical music? I mean, you like it. A lot of people. Have you ever seen a symphony? Have you ever seen anything played live? It's a great experience. You know, my roots are Elvis and the Beatles and the Clash and Nirvana. But when you watch a huge orchestra playing Mozart or Beethoven or Bach, it's really inspiring and awesome. And it's just as powerful as rock and roll could ever be. So today I want you guys to look at these two documentaries. I'll post them. And you'll probably write a paper or two about these characters, these important musicians. Because in the scheme of things, what makes us different, special from all the other creatures out there? We're mammals. We maybe our brains are more developed. They are, and so we could do highly intricate things like composing music. And now, is that building a house, or is it earning a living? Is it bringing home enough money to feed yourself and your family? Maybe not. But do we need music? I think I'm answering the question. Yes, we do. Because it's these things, our music, the painters we talked about last week, the playwrights, the writers we're going to talk about later, the filmmakers, they make our humanities what we are. And at the end of the day, that's all we essentially are, is what we leave behind through our art. what we've achieved as humans on planet Earth. So there's a documentary. I'll find a better one. I don't like the one I was looking at, but I'll post it later. It's on Mozart. Mozart, maybe you've heard of him. He's most famous composer in the world, along with a few others. He was a child prodigy. He was writing operas at 5 years old. He was he was kind of like our first rock star. He got famous in his time, and he was a difficult, talented person who didn't play by the rules. That's why he was a genius. And I don't like tossing that term around, but you have to say he's a genius. Absolutely. How does a 5-year-old write an opera? Where does that come from? He didn't have time to go to school. He's barely toilet trained, folks. Probably not on a flushing toilet either. So how does that happen? How can a 5-year-old write music? How's that possible? So he was blessed with this talent. It was kind of scary. Child prodigy, giving piano concerts, 10 and 12 years old. And he was supported, like a lot of people in those days, artists were supported by wealthy patrons. A lot of politicians and kings and queens and princesses who would like a favorite musician would give them money to live on and to compose music. They weren't like we have to do now. They're not trying to record a CD to sell or get a contract at a record company. There was none of that. In fact, there was no way to hear this music or see it unless you saw them in person. You had to go to where they were conducting these things, and usually it was in the big cities of Europe. And that's how you saw them. You had to make the journey to the ornate Neoclassical Opera House or the King's Palace. They played a lot of music for royalty. Anyway, I want you to look at this documentary on Mozart. Tell me, get your first impressions out there. There was a really good movie years ago called Amadeus by Milos Forman. Seek it out. It won a bunch of Academy Awards. Came out in, I'm trying to think. I have to think. I think the early 80s. I might be wrong. It could have been 78. Anyway, and it's about Mozart's as his most infant terrible. He was a spoiled brat. He was, and he was playful, and he paid the cost for it. He lost lots of patrons in his day, and he paid the cost for his rock star ways. He'd like to have a good time. Let's put it that way. The other one I want you to look at is Beethoven. Came later, and those are the two that most people have heard of, and that maybe you've heard their music. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, his Fifth Symphony are famous. They're used in movie soundtracks, commercials. It's been over commercialized. It has, for sure. There's a great BBC documentary. You can watch that. Now, that's in 3 parts. I'm not demanding you watch all 3 parts, but watch one of the parts. Maybe part 1 will be the best. I'll post that later, and I'll post the link to that, so you'll see how to get there on YouTube. But it's Beethoven was another complicated genius who, besides being a very demanding, very successful conductor, and a person who wrote symphonies, he also went deaf. And they think he wrote his last symphony completely stone deaf. He couldn't hear anything. But he heard it here inside his head. And when I say write a symphony, if you have a 100-piece orchestra, yeah, folks, sometimes they're 100 pieces, and you have violins, you have 20 violins, oboes, and cellos, and French horns, and kettle drums, and on, and flugelhorns, you write when you're writing a symphony, you write for each of those instruments. You write their parts. If there's a solo, if they're accompanying the flute part, if there's a flute solo, you will write that solo. That's how difficult writing a symphony is. You're writing for every instrument in a symphony. Each of them have a part, and none of them makes sense until they all play together, and it all comes together. And that's when you hear the beauty and the savagery and the talent and the genius of people like Mozart and Beethoven. I'm going to post those today. I'll do it a little bit so you can go look at these documentaries. I'm going to do another lecture tomorrow because I got to continue with music here. I'll probably maybe do 2 lectures this week, more on music, and I'll sign assignment tomorrow for you can write a paper. You know, it's like we do our weekly thing. You're going to write a 3-page paper. Probably, I haven't decided yet, but probably on one of these classical musicians. If not, I might give you the option, some other option. But you need to read about these guys. So read your chapter 26. If you don't have the book yet, or you're not going to get the book at this stage of time, we are in week 4. Check out these documentaries. They're important. Sit through them, take notes, look at them. Here's the deal. When I'm getting some good essays on this last essay. What was it? I've already forgotten. Was it the playwrights? African American playwrights? Was that the essays? Yeah, I haven't done to the Dutch Painters was due last night, and I haven't got to those yet. It takes me 5 or 6 days to grade these things. It's a lot of papers. I also teach other classes and for other schools, and I'm grading, teaching, I'm juggling 3 or 4 other classes and all their papers too. So please have patience on the grading. I try to get it out there, and I try to make a comment. I was really impressed with a lot of the essays on the African American playwrights. Some of you went where I needed you, where I'm trying to get you to go. Instead of just giving me a thumbnail Wikipedia sketch on somebody's life, look deeper than that. Try to figure out why. Why did they make a difference at that point in their history, in our history? Why is it important? Are they still important? Are they still important? Same with this music. I want you to look at these and try to figure out what made Beethoven tick, what made him who he was. If you could find this out, I know you only have 5 or 6 days to do it. I don't expect you guys to go that deep into it, but some of you went deep. Some of you actually read a couple of the plays that from the playwrights last week and said some very in-depth critical analysis. That's what I'm looking for. I'm not just looking for when they were born and when they died and who they were married to. That's just Wikipedia stuff. I know you got to add that in there. That's fine. But take this documentary. You're going to watch on one of these two guys and tell me what you see, what you hear, what makes them, and why are we still playing this music 300-400 years later, and why will we always play this music? That's how meaningful and revolutionary they were. So check that out. These documentaries. Today it's Mozart and Beethoven. I'll assign more tomorrow and to look at, and probably more at the end of the week. We'll even have discussions, or I'll let you write your papers on it. I'm not sure yet. I'm still formulating that. But this week is Music Week. Do you appreciate music? Do you like music? What kind of music do you listen to? Do you like modern music? Do you like Lady Gaga or hip hop? Or do you listen to old school rock and roll from the 70s? Or you don't listen to all of it. Maybe you like country and western music, bluegrass, the blues. Music is so heavy, and just to have a week to cover it is really frustrating for me because I'm obsessed with music, and to do a thumbnail survey on all music is frustrating because we could go way deep. Well, we can only do what we can do. And so go deep on these two guys. Look at these documentaries and watch for another post in the assignment post tomorrow. Stay safe. I was just out at the supermarket. Everybody's wearing a face mask. So the pandemic is far from over. And California is requiring us now to wear them in public. Um, Hopefully, you guys are doing that and staying safe because you want to keep going. You want to stay healthy and you want to keep your loved ones and your family healthy too. So, in the meantime, we're online together. I still haven't got the Zoom thing going yet. I think I'm going to give it another shot this week. We'll see because I would like to see some of you, meet some of you on Zoom. I'm going to try it again. I'll give you the heads up on that. So look at chapter 26 of the book. Give you a thumbs up right now. These last essays, I have not read the Dutch painters yet, so maybe I'll have to give you a thumbs down after I read them. Who are still need encouragement. We all need encouragement. Hopefully, I'm doing that for you guys. Anyway, I notice everybody's texting me now because I need you to watch these things, and that's how I'm kind of keeping tabs on if you're paying attention or if you're involved in the class at all. Are you watching the videos? It's just like being in class. It's just like listening to me lecture in class, except for we're not in the room together. Or you're in your rooms, I'm in my room. And that's how it's going to be for quite a while, looks like, from what I can see. So anyway, that's a brief rundown of a very important time in our history. And we're going to focus on music this week. And so enjoy it and listen to some music and let's start talking about it. The conversation continues and the story of humanities continues. I'll see you later.